Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Life of Purpose as we continue looking at the complicated life of the Apostle Paul. We started the journey with him when he was young, being born in Tarsus, and most people believe he was born around 5 A.D. in Tarsus, and he was born a Roman citizen, and so he is born into a prominent Jewish family, but he's a Roman citizen, and he really is growing into being a very prominent young Pharisee when we first really encounter him. He is very adamant to persecute as many Christians as he can, but then he becomes one. And the rest of his life is lived out trying to spread the gospel to the Gentiles, and then even trying to still be a part of what the disciples are doing in their ministry that is really centered in Jerusalem. And so as we're now, as you can guess, in our last episode, we're nearing the end of the life of the Apostle Paul. We're going to be dealing with what happens with Paul that leads to his death, and how his theology, his understanding of Jesus, his understanding of how you live as a Christian, what role that plays in his ultimate death. And he dies around 65 A.D.
Yeah, it's kind of the end of the story for Paul starts as he's ending his third missionary journey, and they've been collecting an offering for the church in Jerusalem because there had been a famine, and Paul wanted to sort of build relationship and credibility with the church in Jerusalem, but he also wanted to help them and try to connect really all these churches together. And so, collecting this offering was a way that he did that. And so he comes back to Jerusalem. He presents the offering to the disciples, and then he decides to fulfill a Nazirite vow. Mm-hmm. And that's an old vow from the Old Testament. You shave your head, and you
don't eat certain things, you don't drink certain things, you don't do certain things.
Right, yeah. It's a very strict period of time. It's kind of like Lent, except on steroids. And so, and you wouldn't take those either. But anyway, so he just takes this Nazirite vow. He goes to the temple to worship and make sacrifice. And he is noticed there by some of what we call Judaizers, or what the New Testament calls the Judaizers, the ones who just can't get past that you don't have to be Jewish to be a follower of Jesus. And so they make up a story, they take half-truths and say that Paul had taken someone who was not a Jewish person into the temple, which was, of course, totally against Jewish law.
Right.
And they began, similar to Jesus, they were whipping up the crowd, everybody gets ready. And unlike Jesus, though, the temple authorities, suddenly they come up against a wall, because once again, Paul plays the card of, I am a citizen of Rome.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, when the crowd is going crazy, the Romans take him as a prisoner, and they are waiting to everything to calm down a little bit to have him tried by the Jews, persecuted or killed by the Jews, whatever needs to happen. And he mentions that he happens to be Roman. Not just Roman, he happens to be really Roman. He's a born Roman citizen. And of course, at that time, he appeals his case and says, I need to be treated as Roman. And, there's a crisis in that, because there's a crowd, there's a mob that's mad, and you can't leave him in Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem at the Antonia Fortress typically would have anywhere between 100 to 500 to 600 men stationed in the Antonia Fortress and around the city of Jerusalem. But it's not a large group of people compared to an angry mob of the Jewish people. And so they determined that they need to relocate him to Caesarea by the Sea. Caesarea by the Sea is a very interesting city. It's on the Mediterranean Sea. It had been built by Herod the Great. Herod the Great, who, of course, wasn't Jewish, had been appointed by the Roman Senate to be the king of of the Jews, the king of Judea. He is appointed as that because he had curried favor through the war with between after the death of Julius Caesar, and you have Mark Antony, which he names the Antonia Fortress for, but Mark Antony is against Octavian, who becomes Caesar Augustus, and when that's not going well, Herod switches sides.
He played it well.
He played it well. He switches sides and becomes Octavian or Caesar Augustus' main supporter, and so suddenly he finds himself a king. And he really wanted Caesar to come to Israel. So he built a deep sea port. He used break fronts to bring the ocean, bring the Mediterranean Sea in, and to create a deep sea port that a Roman boat could dock in, and did dock in on several occasions. You would have Romans that would come there. The Roman soldiers would enter and leave Israel through there. The Roman governors all lived in Caesarea because it was a fully Roman city. You had temples to Roman gods. You had temples to Caesar. You had a hippodrome. You have a Colosseum that's there. And so that's where the majority of the army is, because that's where the Roman governor is, and that's where where often the Jewish, whichever one of Herod's sons might be in power at that point, would live there part of the time. Agrippa, in this period of time, would live in, Herod Agrippa lived in Caesarea because it was the nicest city as far as that went in Jerusalem, in Israel, and Jerusalem was the holy city, and Caesarea was the party city, I guess. Well, that's where all the soldiers were. And so the idea was take Paul from Jerusalem, where it's dangerous, where there's a lot of Jewish people who are really angry, and take him down to Caesarea where he can be tried as a Roman citizen. He can be tried before the Roman governor who was there. And is great. I mean, Paul is one guy. He's one guy that is probably he's probably around 60, well, around 55 years old now, 60 years old, somewhere in that range. So in that period of time, he was fairly elderly because of life expectancy. So he's an older gentleman. He has gone through a lot.
His body has taken some
beatings, literal beatings over the years. And so they start to move him, but they're so panicked about the crowd, they order that they have 200 foot soldiers marching with him, 70 horsemen riding along with him, and 200 spearmen ready to protect Paul, to get him, as a Roman citizen, from Jerusalem down to Caesarea. It tells you how, being a natural-born Roman citizen, how important that was. They didn't want it on their heads that they let a person born a Roman citizen be killed by an angry mob. And so you have 470 soldiers and a centurion at the head of this army leading and carrying Paul down to Caesarea by the sea so that he can stand trial. And of course he ends up standing trial with two Roman governors, Felix and Festus. There's a governor change during that period of time. He's imprisoned there for 2 years. But their anger, while it's the tipping point for them was the accusation that he had brought a Greek into the temple, not leaving them in the court of the Gentiles, but actually bringing them into the temple. That was the tipping point. The major issue was Paul's theology, his understanding of God and how to be faithful to God, was all now seen through the lens of Jesus and no longer seen through the lens of the law. And that switch had caused anger to start building in the Judaizers, because they believe in Jesus, but they're still following the law to its final letter. You know, no jot, no tittle being removed from the law. They're still doing that. And Paul is writing to people like the Galatians, And he's writing the Galatians and saying, we ourselves believed in Jesus so that we could be made righteous by faithfulness, the faithfulness of Christ, and not by the works of the law. He actually goes on to say, because no one will be made righteous by the works of the law.
Well, that'll get a Judaizer pretty excited.
That absolutely will. I mean, because you just don't do that. I mean, he said, did you receive the Spirit by doing the works of the law, or by believing what you heard about Jesus? That's when you receive the Spirit of God, is through what you've heard about Jesus, not by, oh, I kept law number 608 today, and so, nope, no Spirit. And so he gets very critical with this as he writes to the Galatians and in his other writings as well, but especially in his writings to the Galatians, because he's saying, tell me, those of you who want to be under the law, don't you listen to the law? It was written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman, one by a free woman. The son of the slave woman was conceived normal. The son of the free woman conceived through a promise. And these things are an allegory. The women are the 2 covenants. And so he's talking to them about the fact that you are part of this covenant that is great. But the covenant that comes through Jesus, this new life in Christ, it is greater than the covenant of Abraham, the covenant of Moses. It is greater than all the law that has gone before. That's where we put our faith, because Christ has set us free from the law. He has set us free from trying to win our favor with God by doing all the right things. Christ has set us free from that when we put our faith in Him.
Yeah, and it's not far from what John says. As you know, before you had Moses, but now you have Jesus, and you had the law, and now we have grace and an age of grace. And so you have the 2. I mean, it's literally where we get the words testaments. Mm-hmm. You have the Old Covenant or Old Testament, and we have the New Testament, because the covenant changed with Jesus. Now, it's fascinating to me to watch Paul mature as a person. Mm-hmm. Kind of, I mean, as you get older, and we're all getting older, there's this moment where you go, I don't know how it's going to, I know that life doesn't go on forever. I don't know how it's going to end. And Paul didn't know how it was going to end. But it's fascinating how he perceived that even being arrested, that it allowed him to preach the gospel to people of increasing importance. Mm. He preaches and nearly convinces some of them, and they listen to the rational argument. And then he goes on in the appeals process to different folks, and he looks at it and he says, yeah, I mean, it's bad that I'm in prison, but look at all the people that I get to preach to.
Right.
I mean, it's a fascinating thought. And I guess one for me that helps me in difficult days to go, oh, this is not good. But what in the world could God do good in this situation?
Right.
And Paul makes the best of it. He writes a lot of letters from prison. Mm-hmm. His theology over time, we start seeing these deep passages of describing God in ways that, and Jesus in ways that perhaps no one else had. You look at Philippians, and he said, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus, who, being in very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, but becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. But therefore God exalted him to the highest place, and gave him the name that is above all names, the name of Jesus, that every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. He begins to write, and some people believe that this was actually a hymn. Begins to write these amazing. Colossians chapter 1 is another example. Mm-hmm. He is the image of the invisible God.
Right.
And just such rich thought as he gets older, it all begins to sort of kind of gel. And his writings from the book of Philippians, and one of my favorite books is Philippians, as he says, for me to live is Christ, but if I die, I still have Christ.
Yeah, it's a gain.
It's either or. But if I can do some good on this earth,
yeah,
then I'm going to keep doing it. And all these people that he had made friends with, who are mentioned in a lot of the letters. Eventually, he went to Rome, and he was, of course, he had a shipwreck on the way, and got bit by a snake, and eventually makes it to Rome, and he's under house arrest. And all of these people who have supported him, so many of them came to Rome and were with him and helped take care of him and bring him gifts and food and supplies. And you see this man who can't control his destiny completely, but that beloved community wraps itself around Paul in his hardest days. And his day does come. He ultimately, by appealing to Rome, he bought a lot of time.
He did.
But ultimately, you're appealing to Caesar, who blames the Jews and the Christians for everything that's gone wrong in the world. And Paul was Hebrew among Hebrews. And
he's Hebrew among Hebrews and Christian among Christians.
Yeah, and so Paul meets all the categories. And so he's ultimately put to death, but he's beheaded.
Right.
And because he's a Roman citizen, he didn't have to, you wouldn't be crucified as a Roman citizen. But his life takes on this amazing, when you get to the end of it and you look back, you see this person who started off as this fiery, preaching guy. He ends up being this person somewhat like Barnabas, who's able to encourage others, to build community, and really to be surrounded by that community of faith even to his very, very end.
It's a beautiful thing that so many people do travel to Rome to be with him. And the church tradition tells us that Peter is also being held in Rome at the same time. Nowhere near where Paul is being held, but Peter's being held. And, of course, Peter dies in 67 A.D. in Rome, and he is not a Roman citizen. And so he does not get... I was going to say the luxury of being. It's not the luxury, but
actually worse.
Whatever. Yeah, he does not. He is not beheaded as Paul is, which would be a quicker death.
Yeah,
it'd be a very quick death. Peter, because he doesn't view himself equal with Christ, refuses to allow himself to be crucified in a normal fashion. He demands. He requests that the cross be inverted and he be crucified upside down. And many people will think, how in the world would Peter have the power to ask that or demand that? The reality is, he probably, in requesting it, the Romans, who were always looking at ways to make crucifixion more of a torture, where you could live longer on the cross and suffer longer in your death, they probably looked at that as let's give this a try. We haven't thought of this one, and let's flip him. And so he was crucified upside down, and but they're both of these people are dying in Rome within 2 years of each other. But Paul, even though he never really has a moment of extended, multi-year extension of ministry with the disciples themselves, the original 11 and Matthias. He always is doing his own thing with his own community. It still shows how God works through each one of us. We're all part of the body of Christ. We all have our gifts and we all have our abilities. And Paul takes his, where I reading into Paul, I think Paul would have loved to have been, in the early days, Paul would have loved to have been sitting in that 12th seat. Not Matthias, chosen by casting lots and because they realized that they were one short after Judas. Paul, having been called by Jesus into discipleship on the road to Damascus, I think Paul would have loved to have been seated among them at that table. But that never was his lot in life. that lot never fell to Paul. But isn't it amazing what God did through Paul when he embraced this new opportunity? He embraced this new community that he creates into the beloved community, and then shows us how to create the beloved community in our church and in our community and in our world even now.
And so Paul kind of lives out for us what it means to die, what it means as we get older in life to realize, I only have a few years left. What do I need to be working on? And he is able to show us how you live a life to the very end, following Jesus Christ with all your heart.
Absolutely.